Did Texas settlers really fight a war with Bigfoot? In the 1830s and 1840s, a three-letter phrase was often scribbled on the doors of abandoned cabins across the American South, GTT, gone to Texas. It was the anatomy of a promise. A land of vast open spaces, a chance for a new beginning, and cheap territory offered first by the Mexican government and then by the fledgling Republic of Texas. The numbers tell the story of the pull. From a population of roughly 20,000 in 1830, Texas exploded to over 140,000 by the late 1840s. But the Texas frontier was not an empty paradise. It was a place of profound, immediate danger. Life here was unsparing. Children were viewed as miniature adults, expected to work from dawn until dusk, just to help their families scrape by. And this land, this promise was already spoken for. The epicenter of our case is found in Lavaca and Jackson counties, along the dense, swampy, and claustrophobic thickets of the Navidad River. For the settlers trying to carve out a life in this wilderness, fear was a constant companion. This wasn't just a frontier. It was a contested, active war zone. Conflicts between the settlers and native tribes, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Lipan Apache, were brutal, personal, and relentless. But in 1836, a new kind of fear began to seep through the homesteads along the Navidad. It was a fear that didn't fit their understanding of the world. A mystery that didn't behave by the rules of their known dangers. The case file opens quietly. Food began to disappear from kitchens in the dead of night. But the thief was peculiar. He would never take the whole loaf of bread, always, as one account notes, leaving one half. The guard dogs, the frontier's essential first line of defense, never barked. Then tools started to vanish. An axe from a stump, a knife from a workbench. Days later, those same tools would reappear in the exact place they were taken from. And according to a local historical marker, they were returned polished bright. On occasion, torn clothing would be taken only to be returned later neatly mended. This wasn't common theft. It wasn't the behavior of a known enemy. It was almost polite. The enslaved population in the area had a name for it. They called it the thing that comes, and they feared it like a phantom. The settlers themselves felt a confusing, contradictory mix of terror and pity. What was it? A ghost haunting the river bottom, a reclusive eccentric, or something else entirely? This strange, quiet case file would remain open for 15 years. Today, cryptozoology researchers often cite the wild man of the Navidad as one of the earliest and most important Bigfoot reports in Texas. But this is a modern label, a contamination of the evidence. The term Bigfoot wouldn't even be coined until the 1950s. In the 19th century, these entities had a different name, wild man. And if we look at the original case file, the initial profile doesn't describe a giant ape. It describes something stealthy, intelligent, and unmistakably human in its behaviors. It polished tools, it mended clothes. This was not a monster. This was a man. But legends are living things. They don't stay pure. They grow, they twist, they bifurcate. The reports began to speak of a pair, a male and a female. And it's here in the telling of the female, the wild woman of the Navidad, that the human profile begins to dissolve, and the monster we recognize today is born. One account, captured decades later by folklorist J. Frank Dobie, details how a group of settlers finally decided to end the mystery. They organized a formal hunt with hounds and horsemen. When the dogs gave chase, something burst from the thicket and fled across the prairie. Eyewitnesses described it not as a man, but as a hairy, ape-like creature. It was impossibly fast, running like a deer, and easily outpaced the fastest horse in the posse. The hunters, stunned, were left behind. The creature escaped, but it dropped what it was carrying. The hunters recovered a wooden club about 5 feet long that was, according to the report, polished to a wonder. This This is the key. In folklore analysis, this is the moment of contamination. The word polished is the linguistic fingerprint that links two separate stories. A bizarre, factual human detail, a mysterious man returning polished, bright tools, was too strange to be forgotten, so it survived. It was cut from its original context and grafted onto the new developing monster myth. Over decades, polished tools became a polished club. The hairy, wild woman was the bridge, the missing link that allowed a human tragedy to evolve into a cryptozoological legend. The Texas legend did not exist in a vacuum. To understand why it mutated, we have to look at the neighborhood. At the exact same time in 1851, newspapers in neighboring Arkansas were exploding with reports of their own wild man. This version, however, was no polite mystery. This was an unambiguous monster. The Memphis Inquirer described hunters in Greene County, Arkansas, witnessing a creature of gigantic stature, its body covered with hair, as it stalked a herd of cattle. Its footprints were measured at 13 inches long. The story became so credible that an armed expedition was publicly formed in Memphis to go hunt it down. This is critical. The concept of a North American ape man was already present in the cultural imagination. It was a narrative virus spreading across the South. And the strange, unexplainable human story from the Navidad was about to be pulled into its orbit. A hairy creature armed with a polished club hunted by an armed posse. Is this a new story, or is it an echo, a distorted, fractured cultural memory of a real ancient species war? The lead goes cold in Texas. To pick up the trail, we have to travel 1,000 miles west into the vast high deserts of Nevada. The northern Paiute people have an oral history, one of terrifying clarity. It was recorded in the 19th century by Sarah Winnemucca, the daughter of a Paiute chief. It is not a gentle myth. It is a brutal, detailed story of survival. Their story recounts a generations-long war against an enemy they called the Sai-Te-Ka. They were described as a fierce red-haired tribe, and in many accounts they were cannibalistic giants. Other native traditions speak of giant races. The Choctaw have the Nahullo, the Navajo, the Starnake. But the Paiute story is chillingly specific. It is not a vague boogeyman tale. It is a story of extermination. According to the legend, a grand alliance of Paiute tribes finally cornered the last of the Sai-Te-Ka at a massive cavern known today as Lovelock Cave. They demanded their enemies surrender. The giants refused, so the tribes piled brush and wood at the mouth of the cave and set it ablaze. They chose to burn their enemies alive. Any giant that tried to flee the inferno was met by a rain of arrows. For centuries, it remained just that, a story, a terrifying piece of folklore. But in 1911, miners began harvesting the cave's valuable resource, feet-deep layers of bat guano. As they dug, they unearthed something else. Thousands of artifacts, mummies, and skeletons. The initial sensational reports claimed they had found the proof. They reported giant skeletons, some allegedly up to 8 feet tall, with visible red hair still intact. Now, modern anthropologists dispute this. They argue the size was grossly exaggerated, and the red hair is a common known result of decomposition. But the legend was already loose. In Nevada, there is a powerful, persistent story of a real bloody war, with a wild race. A war with red-haired giants. That was the Nevada File, a compelling ancient story. But what about Texas? When we cross-referenced the timelines, we found the buried truth. There was a bloody, brutal, terrifying war right on the Navidad River. But it had nothing to do with the wild man. The date, August 1840. Just 4 years after the wild man reports began. In retaliation for the Council House fight in San Antonio, the Great Comanche War chief Buffalo Hump led a massive war party. Estimates range from 500 to 1,000 Comanche and Kiowa warriors on the largest raid the White South had ever seen. Their target, the towns of Victoria and Linville. the absolute heart of wild man territory. The settlers were caught completely unprepared. When the massive war party first appeared, they were mistaken for friendly Lipan traders. Before they could react, Victoria was overrun. Settlers and enslaved people caught working in the open fields were killed instantly. Over 1,500 horses were captured. After sacking Victoria, the war party continued pressing on to the port town of Linville. The survivors fled to boats in the bay, forced to watch in horror as their town was burned to the ground. One eyewitness, John J. Lynn, described the chaotic, surreal scene. Warriors wearing stolen top hats and carrying silk umbrellas, dancing like demons in a drunken saturnalia. This was the real bloody war of the Navidad. 23 settlers were killed. The event scarred the psyche of the entire region. And here we find the hidden psychological mechanism. This is the motive. How could a settler living in this state of absolute existential terror be expected to differentiate between threats? In the frontier mind, the very real, very justified fear of the Comanche, a known deadly human enemy, was transferred. It was projected onto the one mystery they couldn't explain: the phantom in the swamp. The wild man monster myth grew so large so fast because it was fed by the genuine displaced terror of the Comanche War. He became a psychological container for all the horror of the frontier. So, who was the wild man of the Navidad? The true profile of the suspect. In 1851, after 15 years of surviving in the thickets, he was finally captured. He was not an ape. He was not a monster. He was, in the words of the report, a nude African man. He spoke no English. It wasn't until a sailor, one who recognized his native language, passed through, that his story was finally translated. He was the son of an African tribal chief, captured, shipped across the world, and sold into slavery. After arriving in Texas, he escaped with a companion who later died of starvation and exposure. He survived. Alone. In the Navidad swamps for 15 years. He wasn't a monster. He was a human hunted by two different worlds. He even explained the case file's strangest clue: how he evaded the dogs. His tribe, he said, knew the specific hours of the night when dogs will not awaken. He wasn't Bigfoot. He was a survivor. He was sold back into slavery and died peacefully with the name Old Jimbo in 1884. So how does a 19th century human tragedy, a documented story of survival, transform into a 21st century Bigfoot legend? The answer: Hollywood, or at least Texas. In 2008, an influential independent horror film effectively rewrote the entire myth. It claimed to be based on the real diaries of Dale S. Rogers from the 1970s. These diaries supposedly chronicled a series of violent territorial encounters with Bigfoot-like creatures right back in Sublime, Texas. The film was a pseudo-documentary, a clever intentional homage to 70s drive-in horror like The Legend of Boggy Creek. The Dale S. Rogers diaries were almost certainly a brilliant storytelling device, a new myth created to sell an old one, and it worked. The film succeeded in permanently welding the tragic human case of Old Jimbo to the modern monstrous image of a violent Bigfoot. In the end, the answer to our opening question, did Texas settlers fight Bigfoot, is no. They were fighting an enemy far more real and far more terrifying, and hidden in the shadows of that war. The real wild man of the Navidad wasn't a monster at all. He was just a man trying to survive in a land soaked in blood. But the legend of a monster endures. Because sometimes, a bloody story is the only one we want to believe. The past is full of these hidden stories buried under the weight of our own myths. If you believe in digging for the truth, subscribe and join the investigation.